Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Ruiz Ortiz looks set to be the latest passenger on 2020's tune-up train. He is set to face Scott Alexander, so this was reported by Boxing Scene. This is a couple of days ago, but I wasn't able to get to the story. But what I want to do in this video, talk about this fight, but more broader about what we're being served up. And often it's under the guise of, well, it's a pandemic. What can you expect? Well, the simple answer is better. And in Ruiz Ortiz's case, this is a guy who's 41 years old, and Boxing Scene says that it's learned that the heavyweight contender and Scott Alexander have agreed to fight November 7. The Alexander-Ortiz bout is expected to be part of the Andy Ruiz Jr. Chris Arreola undercard. And as we know, Andy Ruiz Jr. had asked for a tune-up, and he's got that in the form of a faded Chris Arreola. The fight date is yet to be announced, but expected to be November 7th, as Boxing Scene reported. I'll come back to Andy Ruiz Jr. and some other names that we've seen in tune-ups or announced in tune-ups because, yeah, I'm not really happy with it. And the whole pandemic, that can be used only to a certain extent. And let's face it, if you're honest with yourself, we were seeing most of this sort of similar behavior even before the pandemic. It's not a new issue. And I think as fans, we can expect better. We should be asking for better, especially because we're dipping our hands in our own pockets to pay these fighters in some way, be it by subscriptions, pay-per-views, just supporting boxing. In some way, money is trickling down into fighters' pockets from the fans that are actually watching boxing year in, year out. But promoters seem to be taking advantage of the situation right now and going, okay, well, tune-ups galore. So the tune-up train, and you would have seen the thumbnail, and here it is again on screen. I felt compelled to put this together because it's getting beyond ridiculous. But of this fight first between Ruiz Ortiz and Scott Alexander, not a great fight. And as soon as I heard the name Scott Alexander, I thought, well, this is another Travis Kaufman level fight for Ruiz Ortiz, a gatekeeper type of opponent. And then I thought, hang on, Alexander has actually fought Travis Kaufman and he lost a decision to him in 2018. So Ortiz has beaten Travis Kaufman and soon to be beating Scott Alexander. And the real disappointing thing for me about this fight is because Ruiz Ortiz has actually only got a limited amount of time left in the sport. And you can say that of all fighters to some extent, but with Ortiz, well, it's coming to the sharp end of his career in terms of the end date because he's already 41 years old. Even if he goes for another year or two, he is definitely well past prime at this point, but he's still a very good fighter, a top 10 fighter, and we should be expecting better. And having these sorts of fights, Scott Alexander, who's a gatekeeper on BoxRec, he's rated just outside the top 50, it's not really good enough at this point. And it makes me wonder, why can't they make better matchups for Ruiz Ortiz? And sure, that's been a problem through his career, but a lot of people said when he joined Al Heyman that it would end. And he did get 2 title shots against Deontay Wilder, but sprinkled in between, there have been less than impressive fights, less than impressive opponents against the likes of Razvan Kajanu. Christian Hammer, that was an okay fight to some extent. But for Ruiz Ortiz, who said he wants to be in the biggest fights, he said he's a top 5 fighter, he fully believes that he is a top 3 fighter, and this is based on his own statements in the past year or so, even since the Deontay Wilder loss. He's saying, I did well against Deontay Wilder, I still have enough to beat anyone else out there who can sort of put their hand up and wants to face me. And we can make the argument, people don't want to face this guy. He's high risk, he's low reward. But we're seeing a lot of fights being made within the PBC, where between different heavyweights. You think you've got Adam Kovnatsky, Charles Martin, Gerald Washington. Those guys, as well as some others, have been facing each other. You can throw Arreola into that mix. Andy Ruiz Jr. is now there. He's going to be facing Arreola. Adam Kovnatsky has basically fought most of the guys that are on the PBC roster. Throw in there Dominic Brazil too. He's fought some of the guys in house as well. So there's a lot of fights to be made, and there is names. Luis Ortiz hasn't fought there. And I guess you can't make other guys fight him, but there is something to be said that Luis Ortiz is at the back end of his career, still rated a top 10 heavyweight, and these sorts of opponents aren't really good enough. We know he's going to beat Scott Alexander. We know this isn't really an interesting fight, no matter how much people want to tell us that it is. And it's not really good enough. And I don't blame Luis Ortiz, but the people who are managing him, that are promoting him, they need to be doing better. And this is also not just exclusive to Luis Ortiz and the PBC. This is all across boxing. We've had Filip Hrgović. He's been announced in a dreadful tune-up where they've dug up a guy that's been out of the sport for 6 years, at least at the pro level. Daniel Dubois in that absolute horrific mismatch of Ricardo Schneider's. You had Joe Joyce having a tune-up fight against Mikael Wallisch. Andy Ruiz Jr., who's going to be on the same card as Luis Ortiz, is facing Chris Arreola. He said, I want a tune-up before facing a guy like Luis Ortiz. And for some of these guys, you can make arguments that, well, maybe they did need some sort of interim step, say in Ruiz's case, after coming off a loss. But the problem is, for some of these fighters, they talk a certain game in public, saying, I'm a top 5 fighter, I'm a top 10 fighter, I'm a guy that cannot be beaten, I'm the best in the world. All of these guys have been saying these sorts of things, calling out different fighters, some of the best names in the division. And then they're sinking down to fights that they really should not be in. This one here for Luis Ortiz is not a great fight. We need to be seeing him in better fights, especially because he's at the tail end of his career. What's he got left in the tank? This Scott Alexander fight probably is not going to tell us much more than we already know. And we can make a case, obviously, oh, well, they're building towards an Andy Ruiz fight. But you look at 2020, and if this is Luis Ortiz's one fight for the year, it's pretty much a wasted year. And you can also say the same for Andy Ruiz Jr. with Chris Arreola. Stylistically, that might be a fun fight to some extent, but Ruiz will win it. And if he doesn't, then he has fallen off horrifically. But these other fights, Dubois, Joyce, Hrgović, you can lump them into that sort of tail end of the prospect phase, sort of, crossing over into fringe contender status. These fights do not test them. It doesn't help with their development. It's really just filling in time. And they're starting to make claims in public that, their actual, resume does not back up in the opponents that they're facing. And I'm sure some will say, oh, well, it's 2020, it's the pandemic, what can you expect? As I said at the better, and I'll circle back to it, better. Because in some cases, these guys can be facing better opponents. Some people have been putting their hand up saying, I'll fight that guy. And then they go into a worse test. It's stuff that they should not be involved in. And in this case of Luis Ortiz, I feel for the guy because he will know that this is not the sort of opponent that he should be in with. But at this point, it is going to be what it is. But it's 2020 all over. The tune-up train has left the station. It's on its journey, and it's picking up passengers as it goes. So Luis Ortiz is the latest to board the train, and it's just unfortunate for boxing fans because these sorts of fighters, the bigger names, the ones that are coming through, you think you Dubois, Joyce, and Hrgović, etc., we're hoping for better fights, and we're not getting them. And falling back and solely relying on, well, it's a pandemic and, people won't pay him. The promoters need to be doing better. They can put more pressure on. They should be making some of these fights. Because what's going to happen is people are just going to be so uninterested. They start drifting away from the sport. I think we're already seeing a level of it to some extent. Some people are really warming up to MMA. People, boxing fans that didn't think that they would be into it, but because there's competitive fights pretty much week in, week out, guys are getting made to fight. And I don't want to get into arguments about how things are structured, but boxing does it to itself. It really does. Why would we be excited about Ortiz versus Alexander or any of these other fights that I've named in this video? We're not. We know that these are just, filling in time, but it feels like a waste of their careers and a waste of our time. And if they expect us to continue to support them to the level that we have been, even before the pandemic, a lot of boxing fans were feeling ripped off with the whole sort of protecting records and being in rubbish fights until there was a meaningful fight, only every now and then. I think what this pandemic is doing is focusing fans' minds because, actually, it's not good enough. They need to do better. And sure, we can sort of point to there's some good fights happening in the sport, but most cards, you look at them, there might only be one good fight on the card. The rest are either mismatches or, basically nothing sorts of fights. And in the heavyweight division in 2020, what have we really seen? A lot of nothing for the most part. You take away those 3 or 4 months where there was no boxing, what was before and what was after, there's only a few highlights. And the big talk, if people aren't going to be stepping into the ring, fighting the sort of guys that they say they can fight and beat, I'm tiring of hearing the rhetoric because, most heavyweights are not delivering at this point. So you got to tip your hat to the guys who are doing it. But for the rest, it's time to up their game. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.